Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar weekly discussion topic video. And this week we're going to be tackling the major topic within the Avatar universe of, I suppose, the details of what exactly happened during the Air Nomad Genocide. Of course we don't know the full story, know the full details, but I think looking at everything that we do know, we can definitely tell a little bit more of the story than is maybe most obviously presented within the show. There are definitely a few characters that I don't think every fan knows about, and a way where, using them and the general idea of what we know what happens to sort of in a way create the story of what happens and tell it in a little bit of a clearer way while answering certain questions and posing other questions that are definitely interesting. So once again, we'll be using the mind map here to explore the different kind of avenues and paths you can take in terms of exploring this general topic. So let's get into it here. The Air Nomad Genocide, of course, is our main talking point here, right in the middle. And then my main topics that kind of stem out from that are, of course, Sozin, the comet itself. I have strategy of the actual fact that it was a battle. I have Gyatso over here, though maybe he's not as important as you might think. Notable survivors here. Air Nomad Council of Elders, again, not the most important bit. And then Afiko, who is probably like the key factor in a lot of this happening. But we'll start with, I suppose, the general background to it. So we all know the Air Nomad Genocide, like roughly when it happened and the details surrounding it. It relates most heavily into, I suppose, Roku's backstory with Sozin, and the fact that once Roku saw his opportunity and killed Roku, once Sozin saw his opportunity and killed Roku, he realized that, to really guarantee that he could make his dreams a reality, he needed to constantly, make sure that the Avatar never kind of came up and, caused him trouble. So immediately Sozin took to finding out a way to basically kill the next Avatar, knowing it would be an Air Nomad, and using the fact that he knew of the comet, which we'll get into in a second. And so Sozin decided, at 82 years old, 12 years after the death of Roku, to harness the comet and attack the Air Nomads. And obviously I note here in my little note that Sozin died at 102 years old, still searching for Aang as he died. And that's basically what is stated by Azula. And we know that he died, not fully successful in a way. The idea that this is a character who was so obsessed with, the idea of the Avatar potentially stopping his plans that he devoted so much of his life to doing that. But yeah, we'll focus on Sozin a little bit here. So we notice his age there when he starts it. He uses the comet to start the war and attack the Air Nomads to kill the new Avatar. Most important point here, which we'll get into in a lot of detail in just a few minutes, Sozin uses Afiko as an advisor to help plan the attack on the Air Nomads. We get also a little fact here that Azulon was born quite shortly into the war, establishing that Sozin had Azulon when he was quite old. Mid-80s was when Sozin actually had Azulon. That's the way the timeline has to work. And then just I have a note here, which I won't really go into here because we're talking about the Air Nomad Genocide, but that effectively Azulon continued on his father's kind of path and almost kind of performed a genocide of the Southern Water Tribe, nearly completely annihilated the Southern Water Tribe, but ultimately couldn't really come close to finishing off the Northern Tribe or anything like that. But just the idea that he continued on the war. And then I note the other question here, Sozin, did he kill his own dragon? Because while Sozin is a key factor in terms of the guy who ordered the attack on the Air Nomads, apart from just the idea of we assume he himself took part in this, the only other, I suppose, obvious thing is just that when did this whole tradition of hunting dragons properly start? And did it have anything to do with potentially the dragon's role in executing this attack on the Air Nomads? But we'll get into that in a second as well. So let's get into Afiko now. He's the first obvious connection that we have here. We'll get let's go to the comet first, because it's covered quickly, and we don't know a ton about it. So it's called Sozin's Comet now. but it was previously known as the Great Comet, which establishes that in Fire Nation history, they've always known that there's been this comet that comes around every so often that does make them more powerful. And Sozin, his big idea, obviously, was that he is the first one to properly come up with the idea of harnessing this power and using it to launch a military attack. Now, they could easily establish that this has happened in the past and we just don't know about it, but Sozin is definitely right now established to be one of the few people who to really use the idea of this comet and use it for the gain of his entire nation. So, comet existed prior to Sozin's use of it, and, you know, just the obvious kind of more heavy lore question of what is the real connection of this comet to firebending. That posing the question of just, is the reason that the comet empowers firebenders in the first place because of like heat energy given off by friction with the atmosphere when it comes in close to the planet, or is it just an inherent thing where like this comet has some connection to firebending, and it being close to Earth allows a firebender to harness it? Like, the question obviously being, is it more of a physics thing of like friction, heat, or is it more of a, it is a comet, comets in the Avatar world are established to be somehow related to firebending, and that's the connection, or what? So that's just some of the ideas that are being thrown around there. We also have this idea here of coming back down to Afiko to cover him. So Sozin uses Afiko as an advisor to help plan the attack on the Air Nomads. But who is Afiko? It's at this point I will say, watch the other video I've done on my channel where I talk about all of the Avatar trading card game characters. Maybe skip ahead and only watch the bits on Afiko and also Malou. But for sure, you will gain a lot more from this video if you watch that video and get the full context for who Afiko is and who Malou is. So I'll link that video in the description. It's a longish video, but I think it's definitely worth watching because I don't think everyone in the fandom is completely aware of the trading card game characters. And immediately I'll say here, in my opinion, there is nothing so contradictory in the Avatar trading card game to justify it being considered non-canon. For me, I treat Afiko, Malou, and all those other characters, Jojo, Kinto, I treat them as canon because for me, they add so much to what we know of like this time period, and there's really no contradictions whatsoever, because as we'll get into here, we really are not told a lot about the details of the Air Nomad Genocide full stop. So the trading card game actually being one of the only places that it's delved into actually makes it such an interesting source of information. So a little information bubble here on Afiko. A key player in how utterly defeated the Air Nomads were, he gave Sozin important information about how to execute his attack, worked as Sozin's advisor for many years before being executed later on, fought against his own people and helped to hunt down other airbenders. And we just I just cover a lot of that information here with the idea that yes, Afiko is Sozin's advisor. When I say here he's a suffocating void user, that means that he is within the canon of Avatar established to be the first known user of the bending air out of people's lungs technique. It's maybe a slightly different version of the technique, but still a very powerful use of it, and you know, maybe something that helps to explain why Sozin thought so highly of Afiko, but also why he eventually ended up executing him later on. So he fought in the war on the side of the Fire Nation. He was one of the people who helped to start the war. We know that Afiko was from the Southern Air Temple, so that's why Afiko knew about Aang. We know that he helped to hunt down remaining airbenders after the initial attacks, the kind of initial war engagement. And then the key fact here at the end, executed by Sozin 5 years into the war as a traitor to the Fire Nation. Now, they don't go much more in depth into that, but the implication being that Afiko the betrayer, this is a guy who you're getting on your side, having just betrayed his own people. What's to say he's not going to betray you? And I think that's the idea that Sozin had the entire time, that what's to stop this guy, who is powerful and was a huge factor in the war, what's to stop him turning his powers against me? And so I think maybe he saw Afiko becoming too powerful, maybe getting into a position where he could, do something against Sozin. So he just took him out as a player in the war, and Sozin had Afiko executed. So that's an interesting one in terms of like what an interesting character. Just this idea of someone who's from the Southern Air Temple, knew about Aang, was around Aang, probably had talks or communications with Aang at some point, and he was the one to inform Sozin about this, which is really interesting in that all of a sudden, while we never really go in depth in terms of explaining what exactly Afiko offered to the Fire Nation to help them gain an advantage starting the war, very clearly just the information that he knew about Aang being in the Southern Air Temple, him telling Sozin that explains to some degree some of the strategy of the war, in that very clearly the Southern Air Temple must have been the main target when the war started, but also, given that they're air nomads, Sozin must have thought that maybe he is in one of the other temples. We'll put our main forces at the Southern Air Temple, but we'll also attack the other temples as well. So that's that stuff. And then just the implication that like he supplied certain air nomad secrets, being an inside man, to the Fire Nation, and that's what gave them the advantage and the ability to completely annihilate basically the air nomads completely. Admittedly, it is surprise attack while being boosted by Sozin's comet. What chance did they have? But Afiko's information must have been incredibly valuable as we get into some of the stuff up here with regards to the strategy. So here's the Fire Nation strategy up here, in that, as I say here, the initial target seemed to be only the Southern Air Temple, since Afiko knew Aang was there. Other temples appeared to be attacked when Aang was not found in the Southern Air Temple, or the other idea that I present here is just that potentially there was just a bigger force at the Southern Air Temple. Maybe Sozin himself and Afiko were both at the Southern Air Temple, expecting Aang to be there. We know, of course, that the air nomads air temples are in hard terrain, mainly because of their verticality. You almost need to use the sky bison to get to most of them. So were dragons used to actually get there? Were dragons a key factor in the war, in that are dragons empowered by the comet, or is it just human firebenders that are empowered? And this begs the question here of, if dragons were used, how did they feel about being used to kill air nomads and sky bison? Was the tradition of hunting dragons started because of dragons going against orders here? And again the question, did Sozin kill his own dragon? Because we know that dragons are somewhat spiritual animals. Like, we see one being trained by one in the past, so there must be some sort of a connection between a dragon and a sky bison, just because they are such important animals, being the kind of origin to a degree of an element. So I think there must be some sense of like they wouldn't want to kill the sky bison, or just do such violent things just because their masters tell them to. So maybe this is where it came from, the maybe potential rift between dragons and the Fire Nation, and why there's only two left, and why Sozin didn't really seem to have his dragon in the later stages of his life. But I just kind of posed the idea here of like, did Afiko have information about secret paths where like firebender armies could just walk up through these secret paths into certain areas of the air temples, or did he just tell them that it needs to be air power, use dragons? And then, of course, the other thing is just sheer power due to Sozin's comet. That is, of course, always a help if you just have sheer power, being able to just completely outpower people. And then question here, after the initial attacks on the temples, they hunted and set traps for any remaining air nomads. Help from Afiko. Obviously, in terms of him being the one to give the Fire Nation information on what would draw airbenders out and into the open towards these traps, which is something that we see in the comic Relics, which is found in the Lost Adventures. If you read that, it gives insight into basically how the Fire Nation went about basically hunting down the stragglers, the people who survived the initial actual fights at the air temples. How they went about hunting them down were because of help from Afiko. They knew what relics to kind of put down in certain places to draw air nomads out, and make it seem that like, oh, here's a refugee place for air nomads, when in fact it was just a trap to capture more of them. Then on the Air Nomad side of things, the question has to be kind of stuff like, they knew that these attacks were coming. I suppose I'll cover the Air Nomad Council of Elders and stuff like that first. This is the leadership of the Air Nomads. There's a couple of elders in each of the temples. How were they taken down? Did they make key decisions in the war, knowing what was about to happen? And some of the questions that come into play are that, like, Aang obviously was told that he was the Avatar when he was, because they knew something was coming. That's what I say here in the Air Nomad section. That the reason Aang is told he's the Avatar 12 instead of 16 is because all of the elders sense that something is coming. Maybe they don't quite know that it's going to be such a direct and brutal attack on them, but they tell Aang for a reason, so he's somewhat prepared. They just obviously are very blunt about it and cause Aang to run away. But some of the questions you ask here are, of course, not all nomads were present in the temples just because they're nomads. Of course, they're going to be traveling around as nomads. They're going to be in all different temples. The Air Nomads don't have a formal military. So in terms of their fight back, yes, they're capable of working together, but they wouldn't have that military leadership. They're, of course, all powerful in their own way because of, I suppose, how strong individually they would be. But you would have to say a formal military having a plan would absolutely take by surprise, even though you are attacking a temple of people who are all airbenders. There are no, at this point in time, no non-bender air nomads, so everyone is a threat to them. But because they take them by surprise in a military kind of fashion up against people who are primarily peaceful, and while they train in like the combat arts, are not particularly, like, I suppose, suited to being soldiers. So you can immediately see just that in terms of training, the Fire Nation had an advantage over the Air Nomads, even though, of course, you have to assume the Air Nomads put up an amazing fight. But of course, the fight wasn't ever, I think, on the Air Nomad side to win in this type of war engagement, because their philosophy is kind of avoid and evade, plus they respect all life. So they would, of course, prioritize getting everyone out, the safety over people and the sky bisons and so on, over like properly defeating and like killing off the Fire Nation. But of course we know there were casualties on the Fire Nation side. Gyatso took out a bunch of firebenders, and of course that must have happened across all of the temples. There were casualties on both sides. Most of the Air Nomads, but also, like, even with Sozin's Comet, the Fire Nation took heavy casualties in this battle, because I think the implication is just that, in general, no one has ever really had a lot of time to properly come up with counter strategies to fighting air nomads. So I think there's just that surprise advantage that the Air Nomads would have with their techniques, that not many people have fought them before, so them going all out would of course take them by surprise. But they would of course prioritize saving the sky bison and lemurs, and we know that of course this has to be the case because some survived these attacks even up to the present day, and they clearly found a new home, at least some of them, on Bonti Island, which is the island that Korra washes up on in Beginnings Part 2, and is later, by the sage there, given a sky bison. So that clearly has to be what happened here. Some sky bison and lemurs escaped the air temples, came to this island, and they've kind of been there over time, and because of the new kind of location that they're now living in, of course, sort of became a different species over time. And then we have little details, like if you look at the background art of certain scenes, you can see that stuff like the Eastern Temple seems like it's really badly damaged, while maybe the West Temple doesn't seem to be hit as hard. So, they're both the temples with the nuns. That's where all the women Air Nomads are. So, like, what happened at the Eastern Temple, that it was just ruined compared to the West not being hit as hard. The West obviously seems like one of the harder ones to get to because of how unusual the structure is, whereas the Eastern potentially was maybe one of the easier ones to actually get to. So you can maybe come up with some sort of an idea there, or something must have happened there that caused a bigger fight to happen and more damage to be caused. But there's definitely lots of little things like that. Gyatso, we know from the trading card game as well, some of the cards that he's involved in, that he fought in these battles, that he fought for a good bit before going down. And, I just say here, clearly went down fighting and took a good few firebenders down with him. Was it firebenders that killed him, or maybe Afiko or Sozin himself? And that's just a sense of, like, if you ever really wanted to turn the Air Nomad Genocide into a story, if they ever wanted to tell the story of this, I think you would have to at some point have a very personal conflict in this kind of battle, and you would have to use it in Gyatso, and maybe if Sozin attacked as well, maybe Gyatso and Sozin fight for a little bit. Maybe Afiko steps in and maybe he's the one, with the help of Sozin, that finish off Gyatso. That it was almost impossible to take Gyatso down, and it took the Fire Lord himself, with the help of the traitor, to take down Gyatso in the end, after him having already taken down so many firebenders. The other factor here is, of course, that Gyatso is basically Aang's father figure. And the fact, the fact I haven't really mentioned here, but just the fact that Aang had left. Aang had basically is trapped in ice at the time that this happened. Just very recently trapped in ice is when the Air Nomad Genocide takes place. So how was Gyatso feeling when this attack came? Was he happy that Aang was not there, that Aang had left prior to all of this? Knowing that, the aim was to eliminate or capture the Avatar, was he kind of happy that Aang had missed out on this, or was he still, maybe he thought Aang had died already, or what? I would love to just get an idea of what Gyatso's thought process was as this attack was coming. Did he see Aang leaving as this kind of lucky coincidence, or did he kind of wish that Aang was there with them and they could give him advice on what to do going forward? Maybe there would have been a sacrifice made for Aang to get him away or something like that. But it's stuff like that that's very interesting to think about, in that they could easily do something where, like, Gyatso and Afiko were like friends, and this betrayal is this huge betrayal of Gyatso, because, like, his best friend potentially is the one who sold out the airbenders to Sozin, basically. So that could be an interesting one. And then just getting to see Gyatso, who's always been, like, established to be one of the most powerful airbenders. I'd love to see him fight some more. But that's the implication of what happened. Just that the Air Nomads put up a good fight, but they went down. That because of their nature and them not being a military kind of nation, it was very much, it seemed like individual stands from certain characters. Probably Gyatso and some of the Council of Elders, some of the monks and nuns must have, put up amazing one-on-one stands. But it seems like, I think the overall goal from the Air Nomads would have been just to get as many people out as possible. But clearly over time, the traps and hunting down, thanks to Afiko and Sozin and so on, ended up taking out basically everyone. But let's get into some of the survivors, because there are survivors. Aang, of course, survived. We know that. That's the whole premise of the show. Avatar: The Last Airbender exists because Aang survived. And the only point I have here with Aang, that's not just pointing out the obvious, of just, did he ever learn the full details about what exactly happened? Did he ever get any sense of the way the war went down? So kind of, was he asking some of the questions I'm asking here? Did he at some point figure out the full details of this? Or is it just something that he accepts and kind of has to move on from? Because there's the other sense, like, throughout all of this, of just that, like, for Aang, in a way, like, when you really think about it, if he had just stayed in the Southern Air Temple, or maybe was moved to the Eastern Temple, it maybe would have saved the Air Nomads at the other two temples, because that maybe explains why the Eastern Temple was hit so hard, in that Afiko must have known that the plan from the Elder Monks was to move Aang to train at the Eastern Temple away from the Southern Temple, and so the only two places Aang is going to be are the Eastern or Southern Air Temple. Maybe that explains why the Northern and Western temples aren't hit as hard as the kind of other ones. But just, like, does that ever play on Aang's mind, that if he had stayed there and maybe been captured, that would have saved most of his people? Because all they wanted was him, really. That the plan from Sozin was, ultimately, if it came to it, wipe out the Air Nomads completely, but I don't think if he had got Aang immediately, he would have just immediately went for all that slaughter. Maybe he would have. Maybe he was completely changed after the death of Roku and would have done that, but I'm not entirely sure. The other character is the other trading card game character, who is Malou, who is known as the Ghost Witch of the Mountain, having basically, in the aftermath of her survival of one of the attacks, come to live in a mountainous region of the Earth Kingdom. And so some of the details we get on her are that she knew her parents, which is very unusual in Air Nomad culture, that she actually knew who her parents were. And it's established that her parents were some of the war's first casualties. Her mother, that's just a bit of a typo there, her mother helped her to escape from the Eastern Air Temple, which is interesting, of course. That makes sense, that she obviously knew who her father was, but her being a girl plus her mother were obviously in the Eastern Air Temple, which is for the nuns. Her mother helping her to escape from the Eastern Air Temple, but kind of sacrificing herself in the process. And we get this idea that she wasn't a master airbender because she doesn't have her arrow tattoos. She hadn't completed her training, but seemed like a pretty solid airbender based on what we know. And on her own became kind of strong over time, living in the Earth Kingdom and kind of hiding away from the Fire Nation. But eventually, after 10 years of hiding, she did decide to come out and properly participate in the war, fighting against the Fire Nation and basically protecting this area of the Earth Kingdom that she had come to know as her kind of new home up in the mountains. To the point where the people of this region of the Earth Kingdom call her, the ghost, a ghost, basically, a ghost witch of the mountain, a legend who people thought could control spirits. And they know her as like a legend who protected them. And that's just really interesting, that there is this section of the Earth Kingdom that treats an airbender who they know is an airbender as this legendary person who they feel can vanish at will and all this other stuff. And then the final point on Malou, and bringing the video towards the end, is just this idea of like, they present the idea in the cards of like, it's thought that she could control spirits, and they say this line about her of like, some say Malou's spirit still protects the forest she loved. So this mountainous forest region. Did she potentially become a spirit? Because with Afiko they explain that, he died at this point. With Malou, she participated in the war, but they never established that she died fighting in the war. So did she live for a reasonably long time, and then when obviously, like, she's from Afiko's era, so like there's no way she could have survived into Aang's era, because she would have to have been like, in or around Bumi's age if she was still alive. So very clearly she potentially could have died of old age. Did she potentially become a spirit? This is something that we know about because of Iroh, because of the Painted Lady. They're both humans who became spirits. Could it be the case that Malou was also one of these people, and she actually is this spirit who does kind of haunt or just protect this area of the Earth Kingdom, this mountainous region? I think that would be a really, really cool thing to do, because as you can see, kind of, if you bring all of this stuff together, you get the idea of it being this really, really interesting story from, yes, a military battle perspective and just learning about this important event in the history of the Avatar universe, but also the character stuff. You have these connections that you can make of just that Afiko and like what made him betray his own people. The cards do a really vague kind of explanation that like the reason he did it was because when he found out that Aang was the Avatar, he was like really, really angry at this reveal, that almost that he maybe wanted someone else to do it. Or I think maybe what they were more alluding to is maybe that he wanted to be the one to train the Avatar, but Gyatso ended up being the one that was closer to Aang. So there might be some level of jealousy here, which could make the obvious connection between Afiko and Gyatso over here. You could then, I think, just as a more of a more emotional story, just tell the story of maybe Malou's parents and her. Just if you want to tell this kind of overall story of just the impact of this event, show characters like the Air Nomad Council of Elders what they knew going into this. Did they know that an attack from the Fire Nation was coming or not? What decisions did they make? Did they did they maybe not warn their people because they knew that maybe they would fight more like a military if they knew an attack was coming, and stuff like this. Tell the story of like, how did it play out? Was it just the attack and it was over as soon as it began, or was it a protracted battle that lasted for ages? The Air Nomads held out for a long time, because obviously the comet only lasts like a day as far as we're aware. So this simultaneous attack against 4 temples at the same time to eliminate an entire nation, like, did it just go as smoothly for the Fire Nation as we thought it did? Bringing in stuff like the dragons, was that a key part? It had given opportunity to develop Sozin a lot more in his later life, show as the kind of battles proceed, the birth of a Zulon, maybe some issues with his own dragons, show the relationship between Sozin and Afiko, how they came to meet, how the betrayal happened, and then the second betrayal of Sozin having Afiko executed. Stuff like that all seems like fascinating to learn about what exactly happened. And then, telling the story of Malou, while also showing Aang and Ice as like people who survived, and maybe like end this sort of a story with just the idea that the Air Nomads have survived, thanks to harmonic convergence, thanks to, Aang's family, Tenzin, that they've all helped to keep the Air Acolytes, keep Air Nomad culture alive, having, at this stage, just covering this time period, it's seeming like the death of a nation, the death of a culture completely. And, covering all these sort of characters seems like such an interesting idea. But yeah, that's the video for now, to cover the my thoughts on the Air Nomad Genocide. In the comments for sure, let me know what your thoughts are here. Your thoughts on characters like Afiko, if you've never heard of him, Malou, and just in general, what you feel went down during these events. I know there's a lot of fan fictions out there that cover these events. Some of them do include Afiko, some of them don't. But just what are your thoughts on the details of what exactly happened here? Some of the ideas and questions I've posed here. Do you agree with them or disagree? Absolutely let me know so this topic can be continued. Would you like to see a story based on this, as I've kind of laid out here, or do you think it's fine just being presented the way it is? It's obviously a tough one to do because it's an inherently brutal and violent kind of event, and in any way showing visuals of this seems like such a difficult thing for this franchise to do, given that it's a Nickelodeon franchise. But that's been the video for this week. In the comments, let me know what other topics you want me to cover in the future, and just in general feedback on the video. But yeah, that's been the video for this week. Thanks for watching, and bye.